All right, take one.
Wait, why are you recording it this way?
Here.
What?
You're taking a really long selfie.
Can you guys like stop? What's going on? What's up with the shaming? The technology shaming.
Do you want me to plug it in?
Okay. Shall I go?
Please do.
Okay. Hello everyone. I'm Katie, as you probably know, and today I will be talking about redlining.
Can't see what?
You can't see the
So just so we can all.
Zoom it up.
Oh my god.
Okay.
I don't understand why we're taking a big selfie.
I'm not getting.
Do you want me to I can fix it.
Please.
Okay.
It's like one of those.
Okay, go ahead.
It's truly ready now. Okay. Hello everyone. I'm Katie, as you probably know, and today I'll be talking about redlining. Just so you know, you can raise a hand and ask questions throughout the presentation, and I'll be happy to take them. So, just so we have a collective understanding of the term, here is the definition of redlining. And redlining is to refuse a loan or insurance to someone because they live in an area deemed to be a poor financial risk. This second part of the sentence, an area deemed to be a poor financial risk, is not truly accurate because what is deemed to be undesirable in these redlined areas is not just from financial risks, it's from a lot of outside factors, which we will talk about later in the presentation. And here is a redline map of Oakland in an article I read. It was written by an author who lived in Oakland, and he was talking about how it can just be the difference of a street, and that can, as you can see here, just the disparity between neighborhoods is really dramatic, especially, and it's also interesting geographically because all of the neighborhoods that are redlined are near the ocean, and then as you go farther back, they get greener. So, redlining was the practice started in the 1930s, and it was the FHA, or the Federal Housing Administration, and the HOLC, or the Homeowners Loan Corporation. They would deem areas unfit by marking the area with red. And how they would deem the area unfit was not really because of financial needs, it was more based off of racial discrimination. So people in these areas were generally either first generation immigrants or African Americans. And as you can see here, this is the comic, and it's you need to speak to one of our loan officers, but the loan officer is the KKK, kind of showing that the odds were really stacked up against African American homeowners during this time because of how their neighborhoods did not receive preferential lending status as did green areas, and how areas with redlining were affected where they were deemed unfit for insurance companies, investment banks, saving and loan associates, and many other things. This also had a trickle effect to the education system in those areas, like job opportunities. Just they were kind of neglected overall, not only through these financial reasons, but social as well. Yeah?
What is preferential lending status?
That means that banks would rather loan to areas that were green than areas that were red. And coincidentally, the zones that were green and received preferential lending status were primarily white businessmen. So as you can see, there was a huge racial disparity in which areas were favored by lenders and which were not. Redlining was outlawed in 1968 under the Fair Housing Act in the Civil Rights Act, and even though it was outlined federally at that time, the effects of redlining still persist in these neighborhoods, and the lasting scars of that time are still even present today, which I will also go over. Redlining in San Francisco. Redlining was existent in many different cities in the Bay Area, as we saw in Oakland, and here as we will see in San Francisco. Personally, as I was reading, I noticed that during the time in the 30s and the 40s when redlining was happening, there was also a lot of immigration into San Francisco of different groups, and redlining, in my understanding, was kind of a reaction to a lot of the different changes that were happening in San Francisco. And some areas that were redlined were the Tenderloin, the Haight, Chinatown, Western Addition, and the Mission. And as you probably know, those are historically areas that were dominated by people of color, so it was not a coincidence that they did not receive preferential lending status from banks. And here is kind of like the security map or the legend of how the areas were redlined, and I'll go over this a little more. So as we talked about, green, the green areas, or first grade was for wealthy businessmen and primarily white families that were very wealthy. And then the second class was like white collar workers, still primarily white, pretty wealthy, or like upper middle class. The third grade was more blue collar workers, people in working class, and then the fourth grade was people who are minorities or first generation immigrants. And then there's industrial commercial, which is over in the financial district and sparsely settled. So, just to kind of go over things, and so I'm not talking at you for so long, because I realized that in lessons that I find effective, I kind of like to switch it up. We're going to watch a video from NPR that I find really helpful, that kind of goes over like the motives of why redlining came up, and just goes a little bit more in depth. So if we get the sound to work, that would be awesome. Okay.
Oh.
No, yeah, we are just doing a little snippet, because I have other activities. The volume's not that.
Chris Rock's famous joke about streets named for Martin Luther King Jr., which tend to be in, let's say, distressed areas. And he's not wrong, because if you look at the way housing segregation works in America, you can see how things ended up this way. Once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Okay, let's look at MLK Boulevard in Baltimore. I want to show you how to see housing segregation in schools, in health, in family wealth, in policing. But first, an explanatory comma. It's the 1930s in the wake of the Great Depression. FDR's president. He wants to bring economic relief to millions of Americans through a collection of federal programs and projects called the New Deal. One part of that New Deal was the National Housing Act of 1934, which introduced ideas like the 30-year mortgage and low fixed interest rates. So now you have all these lower income people who can afford homes, but how do you make sure they don't default on their new mortgages? Enter the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The HOLC created residential security maps, and these maps, they're where the term redlining comes from. Green meant best area, best people, aka businessmen. Blue meant good people, like white-collar families. Yellow meant a declining area with working class families. And red meant detrimental influences, hazardous, like foreign-born people, low-class whites, and most significantly, Negroes. Again and again on these HOLC maps, one of the most consistent criteria for redline neighborhoods is the presence of black and brown people. Let's be clear, studies show that people who lived in redlined areas were not necessarily more likely to default on their mortgages, but redlining made it difficult, if not impossible, to buy or refinance. So landlords abandon their properties, city services become unreliable, in most places crime increases, and property values drop. All of these conditions fester for 30 years as white people flee to the brand new suburbs popping up all over the country. Many of those suburbs institute rules called covenants that explicitly forbid selling homes to black people, and all of this was perfectly legal. Now it's 1968, and MLK is assassinated.
Good evening. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39
Apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot.
Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight.
In the aftermath, Congress passes the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It's a policy meant to encourage equal housing opportunities regardless of race or religion or national origin, and it offers protections for future homeowners and renters, but it does little to fix the damage already done. Over the next 50 years, the Fair Housing Act is rarely enforced. So you can still see housing segregation and its effects in Baltimore and often along any MLK Boulevard in any U.S. city.
Okay, so that was just a little bit of an overview of what we already learned, and it's good to get a new perspective. I don't really know how to work these computers. Okay, exit. There we go. This is full screen. Yeah. So, and also another term that he went over in this was white flight, which is, as he talked about, when people with lower incomes were able to buy homes in the 30s. White people kind of like felt threatened or didn't really want to live in the cities anymore because they didn't like this idea of people of different races or foreign-born people living in quote-unquote their cities. So they moved into the suburbs, into this act of white flight as exemplified in the movie. And then, or not the movie, the video. And then also, as you can see, the language that's used in redlining, like even calling the maps like housing security, it's very racist in the sense that like areas that are like not secure, being full of black people is not right or just. So as you can see, redlining was not really all about finances. Okay, so the second half of the video goes in redlining today, but I kind of wanted to talk about that with you guys. So the impacts of redlining from the 30s to the 60s still has a huge impact on how neighborhoods are set up today. I mean, even think about like Flint, Michigan. They were an area that was redlined, and now they don't even have access to clean water. And so you can see that like neglect to areas that were like historically minority communities still exist today and has very harmful effects on people. This is a statistic from the article that you guys all read for homework, and it is 3 out of 4 areas neighborhoods that were redlined on government maps 80 years ago continue to struggle economically today, which I found to be very insightful because it shows that the scars of the past don't really leave as new legislation comes in. Instead, they manifest in different ways systematically, and they still affect and really disenfranchise people of color. Also, we have to look at how the racial wealth gap plays a huge part in redlining and the how neighborhoods play out today. White families have 10 times the wealth of black families and 8 times the wealth of Latino families, and it's really important to see how these like racial issues intersect when looking at redlining, because it's not just one thing that impacts people. It's kind of a mix of all of these different issues that need to be solved in order to address the issue of redlining. So that was a great segue not Kahoot time, into our class discussion, which is what can be done, what do you guys think can be done to dismantle redlining today? And I encourage you guys to cite the article you read or even anything that you got from the presentation that sparked something for you. If anyone would like to start.
I think it's really hard to like stop redlining. It's kind of like if you're able to stop racism in a sense, then I think that'll help more, because a lot of, at least in San Francisco, a lot of the places that are like kind of that used to be redlining blind are like places that have a lot of like high concentration of like people of color, which is kind of like still like, I don't know how to explain it, but yeah, I think if people were able to work like and stop racism, then I think that might help with the idea that like people of color are supposed to be lower class, like making sure that that's not the idea that everyone has.
But I also think it's kind of bigger than racism. I think it's primarily economic, but racism has cemented the lower economic gain of people of color. So so again, you can eliminate racism too, but if you say, everyone's equal, but then you don't have any economics in there, then the poor people will stay poor. So I think it's a little bit of both. You sort of have to encourage diversity while also helping these people who have been oppressed for years and not really haven't moved up out of the cycle of poverty, a chance to get out of that. Because I think as much as it's a race issue, I think it's also an economic issue as well.
Kind of adding on to that, you kind of cited like the intergenerational wealth disparities between people, between white people and people of color. And I feel like, kind of like what Sophie said, though I don't think racism plays a big role in it today, but it did back then. I feel like in order to solve the issue of people not being able to kind of move between classes, we have to invest in the middle class. So that's through like economic policies, and I could go in depth on that, but just to me it's very broad.
I think that one of the most important things to take away from redlining is that communities, you know, that don't have that, like, have been redlined, it's like 3 or 4 are still economically like struggling, and I believe that it's a big part of that plays in education, because you know you have, you know, a lot of people who are, you know, who are renters, and property tax goes right into funding schools. So I think maybe like more assistance in, you know, funding early childhood education, which has been proven time and time again to be, you know, essential to, you know, academic success for a lot of people. I think that plays a big role to it. Also, I think that just if there's more policy to support people to buy homes, then that would be great, because like what this did was it prevented people, you know, from, you know, buying homes, which, you know, over time would, you know, increase its equity and, you know, be something passed down from generation to generation, and it would continue to grow and build, and, you know, it was never allowed.
One thing, just to tackle the education point, one thing that the San Francisco City Council has tried to do as far as like integrating schools and trying to redistribute racial disparities in cities, they've tried to integrate schools by literally busing kids from like Mission to schools in the north end of the city. And this like ties into the presentation I'm doing, but it's a lot that has to do with the lottery system and how they assign schools. That's not based off of what neighborhood you're in, because they're trying to integrate places. But one thing parents can do is that they can assign and change their school placement through an application. And what the city is finding is that parents are relocating their kids based off of the neighborhood that they're in, which just, you know, reverses any kind of motive or incentive. So like the lottery system could place a kid in Bayview in a school in Pack Heights, but there's something called the parent choice application where parents can say, I don't want my kid to go there, so I'm gonna fill out this application to transfer public schools. And more often than not, parents transfer their kids to schools where their race is represented. So that keeps like white kids in white schools, Latino kids in Latino schools, and that's what's happening in the city. So I think education is a much more complicated issue that I think is not as easily remedied, but it's a really like important thing.
Oh, kind of piggybacking on what Jared said, under Obama's administration, he passed a law, I'm forgetting about it, but it basically prevented or required banks to give out loans with low interest rates to people that couldn't necessarily afford to pay them back. So that kind of gets into this redlining thing where banks are kind of helping people get off their feet with these loans, even though they wouldn't necessarily be able to pay them off, but it's kind of dismantling redlining's effects today.
Well, I also thought it was very interesting about like integration and stuff as well. I personally have some friends who have moved into the Bayview, Hunters Point area, and they're like very wealthy and stuff. And I just think that like with the different like construction projects that are happening and housing projects, that like really kind of helps, I guess like remove this whole redlining thing, just because like there's more of a mix of like wealthy people and like poor people, and so it's kind of like, you know, all getting.
Nick Fizz, do you want to close it off?
Well, I'm sure that one close it up, but I mean, there are several dimensions. I think it's interesting that you started your definition of redlining by talking about areas that are a economic, where the loan was an economic risk, right? And it's important to think about the fact that the last debacle in this country economically happened because what was going on is banks actually gave loans to people who were economic risks with the intention of them to default on their loans so they can foreclose the properties and then sell it a second time to people behind them after that. So it's really interesting, that idea of people went from being targeted, being an economic risk, and therefore not being able to, not allowed to buy a home, to people being targeted to buy a home with the intent of them to default on their loan so that the bank could make more money and repossess the house. And it's, so this economic risk is now becoming an economic incentive. And in fact, I would argue redlining is alive and well today in the banking industry. It has a slightly different tone, has a slightly different feel, but it's redlining today. And you can look the articles, there are plenty of articles online to say that even though it's illegal, even though all that stuff, it is, it's not just that the effect of redlining are still here today, is redlining is still happening today, it just takes a slightly different flavor. It's kind of like redlining 2.0.
But when a house is foreclosed, is the bank making more money when it's like collected as collateral than if it were being mortgaged out?
It has a higher property value.
Because then it can reassess it.
It can reassess it and resell it. It's because during the time it still owns a house, even if the house value didn't go up. When you first pay the house, you pay the interest on the house, like not the people in the house. So all the money you pay at the beginning is like it's extra money for the bank.
Yeah.
In addition to the value of the house.
Oh, and so then when you default, that money gets lost, and they take it as collateral.
So you take it and then just resell the house and do it again. And so. And it's this delicate balance where you don't want to completely stab out the neighborhood because then the property value would go down.
Yeah.
You just want to keep it sufficiently out of price that people default not all at once, so that you can just keep on rolling the thing. And Wells Fargo was accused of that and found guilty. Yeah, I mean it's bad. Like it's.
Do we want to have like one more comment and then it's Kahoot time?
I have a question.
Okay. Yes. Yes. No, you can't ask the question.
Well, how does redlining play into like renting? Because we just talked about like home owning, right?
Yeah. So redlining does a lot with like, just making it not only like more difficult for people to own a home, but like I think it does like bring people more towards renting, because I think the thing about redlining is, this is just coming at it from like a broad perspective, but it's about power, and it's about disempowering people in those areas that are redlining, and when people are renting, then that gives the landlord a lot of power, and like owning a home is in a sense like you have more agency over that, whereas renting you don't. Shall we do Kahoot now? I think the computer's here. Okay, there we go. Okay, so if everyone could either take out their phone or computer. I emailed the Kahoot link to everyone.
What do you think is classic or team moment?
I emailed it to you yesterday,
emailed last
like
night.
last class, because, okay, I have to now log in.
Can we work as teams?
Sure, if you would like to. That makes you happy. it's just kind of a short one, just to like, you know, reinforce some of these concepts we've been learning, and because Kahoot is fun and it's a good way to have like a team.
So what are we doing, team mode or classic?
I think she's starting first.
Yeah, okay.
No, it's class plays, I think.
Yeah, it's classic, but it's like two people want to be one person.
Yes.
Waiting.
What is
Okay.
the code?
If you play as guess, you can.
If you click on it,
Oh,
Say sign up.
it'll give you a code.
No, right.
Stop. Wait, why is it doing this?
Just let it do its thing. It'll.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
There we go.
96407.
And we love the Kahoot music. So that's fun.
God, I really do too.
We love.
I'm sorry,
Kahoot.
how do I do this?
Have you heard the remix?
Classic.
Great.
Callie and Grant.
I have another pen.
Colin.
Oh no, it's because you click
Go
that.
off.
So just go to Kahoot.
Birthday.
Do you want your name, Petty, or do you want Gel?
Just try one.
Because I'm gonna call
All
them
over
later
again.
probably.
I'm playing
Any tab is not working.
I
Gel.
see your
Stay on
nickname.
Okay, is everyone in?
No.
That is fun.
Okay, team down.
Oh, you're good. My bad.
They're just like. Yeah, we'll talk about lunch.
Wait,
This is all recording.
this is the music I'll be playing when I turn
You know how like for like baseball they have like that intro like when they come on.
The
like,
walk
when
song?
Yeah, they should have like that.
Yes. Okay, is everyone almost there? Raise your hand if you're not.
It's like I put my name in and it's like giving me a loading thing.
Okay.
The fizz.
Right.
The mad respect on the name.
What's that?
Respect on the name.
You're just like still loading?
Yeah,
Colin,
I don't know
Colin.
what's up.
Could have been further.
Colin.
I like put my nickname in and hit enter.
Huh. That's curious.
I can, yeah.
If you want to play with someone, if that like is easier for you, but you can also wait.
No, you
You could pretend to be the fifth.
Okay.
we can do it together. Go ahead.
Okay,
Yeah.
we're ready. Yay! Okay, so everyone, it's Kahoot time. Okay,
Am I ready?
are you ready?
Get ready.
What did the HOLC do?
Oh my gosh, it's still big.
I had fun making the answers, so. Nothing.
Definitely that.
Yay! Callie and Graham.
Alright.
How can they be up? There's only been one question.
Oh, it's because
You're the fastest.
also if you're the fastest.
Right.
Yeah.
Like who really knows?
Ooh.
Okay, what does the FHA stand for? We love an alphabet soup. When we...
Oh wait.
Oh my god, everyone's doing awesome.
Planet Homes for all.
What?
Okay.
Still?
Still.
Whisper it.
What? Oh, we got through. Oh, I clicked the wrong thing.
Yes.
You didn't click the red one? I thought I clicked the
Okay.
red one.
Size on the knot.
Richmond.
You can't say the answer out loud, everyone.
Yeah.
The answer.
Is this the answer?
Oh, Parky.
Genius.
Oh, 11.
This is genius.
Oh,
Oh, wait.
damn.
Oh my.
Oh, wait.
Hey!
Still in 11th place now, though. I'm surprised.
Okay, it's our last one. Oh,
What is the question?
you have 20 seconds.
Oh, I don't know what the answer is.
Okay,
Can we do that again?
Oh, add.
Okay.
Who laughs last?
Thank you so much for participating.
Well
Have
done. Great.
Awesome. Oh, and here are my sources.
Woo!
Okay, sources.
Remember the exercise we did yesterday where you were asked to remember some things and many of you did not remember things. I noticed that a lot of people were not taking notes at all during Katie's presentation. So
That's okay.
You might want to jot down some things because
I think we
this
killed
is pretty important. But you'll also want to jot down, something that Katie did well in her presentation, something she might want to work on. And I should probably give you. Yeah, truly. And
That's a baseline.
Emma, do I remember you being next?
What?
Yeah.
Presentation
Who's
has no
next?
flaws at all.
I might be.
I
I need to
think-
print like a few things out.
Let's see. Redlining is
Ready next?
6. Who's 7?
Boy Scouts?
Actually, wait, no, can I
I'm
use the
doing too much.
Oh, wait.
That's
I
it.
need a
You're on a tight ship, Nick.
Concentric ring is indeed next.
Okay.
I believe
Go
in
ahead and
it.
print out your
Well.
stuff.
Fight.